Alexander the Great's body showed no decay for 6 days, because he may not have been dead. He was 32 years old. He had conquered Persia, Egypt, and half of India. And on June 10th, 323 BC, in a palace in Babylon, the most powerful man on earth could not move a single muscle, but his eyes were open. For 6 days, his generals watched him breathe. For 6 days, no priest was allowed near him. And for 6 days, his body did not rot in the Mesopotamian heat. A heat that turns flesh in hours. The men standing outside that door were about to inherit the largest empire in human history. Every one of them had a motive. One of them had the poison. And the official story, the story Rome would repeat for 400 years, was written by the very people who had the most to gain from his silence. To understand what really happened in that room, we have to go back 12 days, to the night of the banquet. Alexander the Great's body showed no decay for 6 days, because he may not have been dead. He was 32 years old. He had conquered Persia, Egypt, and half of India. And on June 10th, 323 BC, in a palace in Babylon, the most powerful man on earth could not move a single muscle, but his eyes were open. For 6 days, his generals watched him breathe. For 6 days, no priest was allowed near him. And for 6 days, his body did not rot in the Mesopotamian heat. A heat that turns flesh in hours. The men standing outside that door were about to inherit the largest empire in human history. Every one of them had a motive. One of them had the poison. And the official story, the story Rome would repeat for 400 years, was written by the very people who had the most to gain from his silence. To understand what really happened in that room, we have to go back 12 days, to the night of the banquet. May 29th, 323 BC, Babylon. A man named Medius of Larissa throws a dinner party. Medius is not a general. He is not a philosopher or a politician. He is a social climber, famous for knowing exactly which powerful men to flatter at exactly the right moment. And on this particular night, he has invited Alexander. That detail matters. Alexander did not choose this dinner. He was invited by a man with connections to at least one of the men who would later claim his throne. Alexander drank heavily that night. Every ancient source agrees on this. But here is what most histories leave out. He had already stopped drinking heavily months before. The campaigns in India had broken something in him. He had watched his best friend Hephaestion die. He had massacred entire cities. He had turned back from conquering the rest of the world because his own soldiers refused to march. A man who had conquered everything and lost the one person he loved. That man had gone quieter, more controlled. So why, on this particular night, at this particular man's table, did Alexander drink until he collapsed screaming in pain? He was carried back to his quarters before dawn. The ancient sources, Plutarch, Arrian, Diodorus, all record the same sequence. First, a piercing pain in the back like a spear thrust, then fever, then progressive paralysis. Over 12 days, Alexander lost the ability to speak, then to move his limbs, then, eventually, to breathe. That progression has a name. Toxicologists recognize it immediately. Veratrum album, white hellebore, a plant that grows across Macedonia and Greece. The ancient world knew it as a powerful medicine and as a weapon. At low doses, it purges the body. At high doses, it causes exactly what Alexander experienced: burning pain, fever, descending paralysis, full consciousness maintained until the very end. That last part is critical. White hellebore does not cloud the mind. It traps it. For 12 days, Alexander knew exactly what was happening to him. He watched his generals file in and out. He could no longer speak to accuse anyone. He could only watch the men who would carve up everything he built: Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Antipater, Lysimachus, Seleucus, standing at his bedside, performing grief. On the 10th day, his soldiers demanded to see him. Thousands of Macedonian infantrymen lined up outside the palace, convinced their generals were hiding a dead king to seize power early. The generals let them in. Every man in that line passed Alexander's bed. Every one of them saw the same thing. A king who could not move, could not speak, but whose eyes tracked them as they walked past. Some of the men wept. Some raised their fists. Alexander acknowledged them the only way he could. He raised one finger. One single finger, lifted from the silk as each soldier passed. That is not a man in a coma. That is a man who is paralyzed but conscious, exactly consistent with veratrum album poisoning at a specific dose. Now, here is where the story fractures, because two ancient sources that were suppressed, that barely survived, that exist today only as fragments copied by later scholars, record something the official histories omit entirely. They say Alexander tried to roll himself into the Euphrates River. Think about what that means. A man who cannot move his limbs, who is fully conscious, who knows he is dying from something introduced into his body, trying to reach the river so that if he died in the water, his body would never be found, never be used, never be buried by the men who poisoned him. His wife Roxane stopped him, pulled him back from the doorway of the royal chamber while his generals slept. She knew, and she said nothing, because she was surrounded by men with swords. Now let's talk about the suspects, because the list is shorter than you think, and one name rises above all the others. Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, the man Alexander had left in charge of the Greek mainland while he marched east for 13 years. The man Alexander had recently summoned to Babylon, not to reward, but to answer charges. Charges brought by Alexander's own mother, Olympias, who claimed Antipater had grown too powerful, too independent, too dangerous. Antipater did not come to Babylon himself. He sent his son, Cassander, a man Alexander reportedly despised so thoroughly that when Cassander once laughed at a barbarian prostrating himself, Alexander grabbed him by the hair and slammed his head into a wall. Cassander arrived in Babylon carrying gifts, and almost certainly carrying something else. The ancient historian Plutarch, writing 400 years later, still names Cassander directly as the delivery mechanism. He cites a source even older, a man named Hagnothamus, who claimed to have heard Antipater's own son Aeolus administered the poison in Alexander's drink. Aeolus was Cassander's brother. He was Alexander's royal cupbearer. His job, literally, was to pour the king's wine. Position, motive, access. The triangle closes. But there is another layer. Because poison this sophisticated, a dose calibrated to kill over 12 days without triggering immediate suspicion, is not something a cupbearer designs alone. Theophrastus, the greatest botanist of the ancient world and a personal friend of Aristotle, wrote extensively about veratrum album's properties. He described in clinical detail how dose and dilution could be used to extend the dyeing process. Aristotle had been Alexander's personal tutor, and by 323 BC, Alexander had broken from him politically and had one of Aristotle's relatives executed. The ancient source Callisthenes, who was Aristotle's own nephew and traveled with Alexander, had already been executed on Alexander's orders for alleged conspiracy. The intellectual network around Aristotle had every reason to hate the king they once served, and they had the exact scientific knowledge to kill him slowly, invisibly, and perfectly. This is not coincidence. This is architecture. 12 days. Let's count them properly. Because the timeline itself is the evidence. Day 1, the banquet. Pain begins. Alexander retires early, burning with what his physicians call fever. Day 2, the fever intensifies. Alexander attempts to continue his duties. He is still planning a naval campaign into Arabia. He dictates orders from his bed. Day 3, Alexander cannot walk unassisted. His physicians are called. They observe fever, joint pain, loss of coordination. They prescribe rest and diluted wine, which, if the poison is being administered in the wine, accelerates the process. Day 4, voice begins to fail. By evening, he cannot speak above a whisper. Day 5, paralysis begins in the lower limbs. His physicians are now frightened, not because they suspect poison, because the symptoms match no illness they recognize. There is no equivalent in their medical texts to a man who is fully conscious but losing motor function from the feet upward. Ascending paralysis. That is the modern term. It is one of the diagnostic signatures of veratrum album poisoning at a sustained dose. The nervous system shuts down from the extremities inward. The mind remains last. Day 6. The generals begin meeting without him for the first time. No record survives of what was said. The secretaries were not present. Perdiccas, who would claim the regency within days, chairs the meeting. Day 7, the soldiers' procession. Thousands of men file past. The finger rises and falls. Roxane stands beside the bed and does not leave it. Day 8, Alexander's ring, the royal seal, the physical symbol of the empire's authority, is handed to Perdiccas. This is the moment. Not the death, not the funeral. This is the transfer of power. And Alexander is still breathing when it happens. Why would a dying king hand his ring to Perdiccas and not to his unborn son? Roxane was pregnant. Or to his half-brother Aridaeus, the only other surviving male heir? The ancient sources say Alexander was asked who should inherit and replied, in a whisper, the strongest. Others say he said nothing at all, that Perdiccas simply took the ring from a hand that could no longer resist. Those are two very different stories, and only one of them ends in murder. Day 9. The physicians attempt a final intervention. They force Alexander to drink a large quantity of undiluted wine, a standard Macedonian treatment for fever. He convulses. He loses consciousness for the first time in 8 days. And when he wakes, something has changed. His eyes are still tracking, but the paralysis has reached his chest. He is breathing in shallow, rapid pulls. Day 10. The date the official records mark as his death, June 10th, 323 BC. But here is what the official records cannot explain. For 6 days after June 10th, Alexander's body does not decay. In Babylon, in early June, with daytime temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, a body in that environment begins to visibly decompose within hours. The ancient Egyptians knew this. It was precisely why they developed embalming. The Mesopotamians knew this. Everyone in that palace knew this. And yet the priests and physicians who examined Alexander's body on days 2, 3, and 4 after his supposed death reported the same thing. No smell, no discoloration, no swelling. The flesh was soft, the face was serene. The ancient world interpreted this as divine, proof that Alexander truly was the son of a god, that even death could not touch him. That interpretation was politically useful, and it was immediately broadcast by the men who had just taken his ring. Modern medicine has a different interpretation entirely. In 2019, Dr. Catherine Hall, a clinical lecturer at the University of Otago, published a paper in the Ancient History Bulletin proposing that Alexander's 6-day non-decomposition is diagnostic, not miraculous, diagnostic. The condition is called pseudothanatos, false death. It occurs in cases of severe Guillain-Barré syndrome, a progressive neurological disorder that causes ascending paralysis while preserving consciousness. Veratrum album poisoning can trigger Guillain-Barré-like neurological cascades. The paralysis descends to the respiratory muscles. The heartbeat and breathing become so shallow, so slow, that an ancient physician cannot detect them with the tools available. The patient appears dead, but the body's cellular metabolism has not collapsed, which is why it does not decay. Alexander may have been certified dead while still alive, paralyzed, unable to signal, fully aware, and placed in preparation for burial while his heart was still beating. Hold that thought, because it changes everything about what happens next. The men who stood to inherit his empire, Ptolemy, who would take Egypt, Seleucus, who would take Persia, Cassander, who would take Macedonia, Lysimachus, who would take Thrace, they were already in the room. They watched him. And within 48 hours of his last breath, the wars began. For the next 46 years, his generals butchered each other across 3 continents. His mother, Olympias, was stoned to death in 316 BC. His wife Roxana and his only legitimate son, Alexander IV, were poisoned in secret by Cassander in 309 BC. The boy was 13. By 281 BC, every man who had stood at his deathbed was dead, most of them murdered. The empire he built in 11 years took less than half a century to disintegrate into the Hellenistic kingdoms that Rome would later swallow whole. His body never reached Macedonia. Ptolemy hijacked the funeral cortege, dragged the gold sarcophagus to Alexandria, and built a shrine around it that Caesar, Augustus, and Caligula would all visit as pilgrims. And then, sometime after the 4th century AD, the tomb of Alexander the Great simply disappeared. Over 140 archaeological expeditions have searched for it. None have found it. Modern toxicologists now lean toward one answer for the death itself: Guillain-Barré syndrome, triggered by Campylobacter infection, a paralysis that would explain the silence, the stillness, the unblinking eyes. Not poison, not murder, a bacterium. But that diagnosis requires you to accept something darker, that the men around him, the generals, the physicians, his wife, looked at a living, conscious, paralyzed king for 6 days and chose to call him dead. Somewhere under the streets of modern Alexandria, beneath 20 feet of Ottoman foundations and Roman